Hi, I just got done grading your discussions on foundations of critical thinking and critical thinking Christianly. Enjoyed what I read, and for the most part, you got real high grades on them. I wanted to give you a little bit of feedback, well, primarily because I had a busy week last week and I didn't get into the discussion boards to participate. And there's just a lot of thoughts I have on this topic. Critical thinking is a broad topic. Several of you pointed out there are multiple definitions out there. I want to give you my definition. Hey, I'm the teacher. I get to do that, right? But I've got to do it really quickly. I'm cheap. I'm using a free version of this recording software, and it limits me to 15 minutes. So I've got a little slideshow here. I'm going to run through my definition and several types of critical thinking and what I think is the most important characteristic of critical thinking. So you're ready? Fasten your seatbelt. We're going to run through these quickly. First, I want to talk about the goal of critical thinking, which is this saying that we often use: don't jump to conclusions. I think only one of you this time around cited a source from a nursing program, but it's interesting that nursing programs in higher education are kind of the leaders in critical thinking. The accreditation standards for nursing programs insist that nurses learn critical thinking. And what's behind this is nurses have to make very important, sometimes life and death decisions on the spot with a lot less training than doctors. So people who train nurses says, how do we help them do this? Well, the worst thing is jump to a conclusion. I know everything there is to know about this patient and this medicine, and so I just do what I automatically think I'm going to do. I have to avoid jumping to conclusions. So nursing programs have emphasized critical thinking. So the goal of critical thinking is don't jump to conclusions, but that doesn't tell you anything about how to do it. So let's think next about the nature of critical thinking. I wish I knew who to cite this to. I don't. But when I was doing my PhD, I remember running into this in a class. The class was run by Dr. Miriam Charter, but I don't think this was her quote. I think she gave it to us from someone else. That critical thinking is anything that helps me think more objectively. I tend to be subjective in my thoughts and to just see things the way I see them and assume that I'm right. And critical thinking helps me break that assumption, see things other ways, and improve my thinking. To be more objective, more outside myself, more seeing things the way God sees them. But also in the nature of critical thinking, critic, the word critic or critical, comes from the Greek word for judge. A kritikos was a judge, someone who passed judgment. So critical thinking is, in the nature of it, judging thoughts. Just like the goal, don't jump to conclusions, doesn't tell me how to do it. Telling you that critical thinking is judging thoughts. Gets you at the nature of it, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. So let's talk about how to do it. So here's Rumley's definition of critical thinking. Far from the only one. And you're not required to use this. But I just read all of yours. Here's mine. Critical thinking is subjecting one's own thoughts to rigorous judgment based on reliable standards or processes. In order to judge something, I have to have some standard. Is this board long enough? I get out a tape measure and measure it. The tape measure is the standard, and I measure the board against the standard. So if I'm going to judge thoughts, I have to have a good standard. Judges have to know the law. And in critical thinking, there are several possible standards. There isn't one standard that fits all situations. And many of the definitions you found used different standards. So I don't want to jump to conclusions. I want to judge my thoughts by subjecting them to rigorous judgment based on reliable standards or processes. I'll talk about that processes in a minute. So, first reliable standard. Logic is a reliable standard. Many of you cited things from criticalthinking.org. The folks that put that website up, their main thing, they allude to other things, but their main thing is logic. So there are accepted rules of logic, and I don't have time to talk about them, but probably the most commonly cited one is the rule of non-contradiction. Basically, you can't contradict yourself and be logical. But there are accepted rules of logic, but there's also taking your thinking through the process of logical examination, asking myself, is my thinking logical? So logic is a reliable standard, and taking my thoughts and putting them into standard logical forms like syllogism is a reliable process for judging my thoughts. Second common, and these first two are the two most common in the whole world out there, form of critical thinking is scientific observation is a reliable standard. In science, we do controlled experiments. We make sure they're reproducible. We want reproducibility. That is, I can write up what I did in my experiment, and an experimenter in China, after my write-up's been translated, can reproduce my experiment and get exactly the same result I got. And when we can do that, then we have science. We have tested knowledge. But most of us rely on science done by others. Most of us aren't first-hand scientists. We use science, we trust it a lot, but for the most part, we don't do it ourselves. We get it from others. So that brings us to the next reliable standard. Expert opinion is a reliable standard. And this is the standard you use when you cite scholars in your paper. The point in citing scholars is to support what you have to say. It isn't to report what they say. You're making an argument in your paper. You cite them to support what you say. They are the experts, and you're using their expert opinion as a reliable standard to support what you have to say. Now, in a ministry program, most of the people you're citing aren't scientists I just talked about. Most of them are scholars of other types, theologians, educators. But they are experts, and expert opinion is a reliable standard. It's not perfect. As I am recording this, you're doing a commentary comparison. And there are many questions you could ask or about a verse of the Bible and say, well, the joy of the Lord is your strength, Nehemiah 8:10. The joy of the Lord. That could mean the joy that I get from the Lord, or it could be that the joy that the Lord expresses over what I'm doing. And I've studied that passage before, and I'm pretty sure if you got out 100 commentaries, you get 50 that take it one way and 50 that take it another. So when you run into that situation, you know expert opinion isn't going to fix things for you. But it's still a reliable standard. It's just not an absolute standard. Checking assumptions is a reliable process. Now, this one isn't a standard per se, but it's impossible to think without assumptions. When a scientist does his or her experiment, they are making assumptions about the nature of reality, that it is observable, that it is consistent, and that it's knowable. And some assumptions are better than others. The assumptions of science have proven to be very reliable for physical phenomena. For other things, like, say, human behavior, well, psychology and sociology develop a science of human behavior, but they're not nearly as reliable as chemistry and physics, because the assumptions work better for chemistry and physics than they do for human behavior. And then you come to a theology, and you have some scientists who say things like, are ardent atheists and say, because science can't prove God. Well, they're assuming that the scientific method and controlled observation can examine everything. And just because God can't be examined by that, it's not a good assumption that he doesn't exist. They're making an assumption about their process. So if you're going to be a critical thinker, you can't assume too much, and you have to test your assumptions. Are my assumptions good assumptions? Are they reasonable assumptions? And that's all you can come to, is that they're reasonable. That the scientific method will work when examining a plant is a reasonable assumption. When attempting to examine God, it's an unreasonable assumption. When you're talking to another Christian about truth, that you can talk about the Bible and you'll both acknowledge the Bible as truth is a reasonable assumption. When you're talking to a non-Christian, that's not a reasonable assumption. So checking assumptions is a reliable process. And then comparing viewpoints is a reliable process. No one sees everything about a situation. You know the old story about the blind men and the elephant. I assume you do. That 4 blind men were examining an elephant, and one put his hands on the side and said an elephant is like a wall. Another grabbed the tail and said an elephant is like a rope. Another grabbed a leg and said an elephant is like a tree trunk. And another grabbed the elephant's trunk and said an elephant is like a hose or a snake or something like that. If they can compare all their viewpoints, they know a lot more about the elephant than if just one of them states his viewpoint. So comparing my viewpoints to others helps me fill in gaps. And by the way, this is one of the reasons for the discussion boards. That's what's supposed to be happening there. We compare viewpoints, we fill in gaps. Then another reliable process is looking for power dynamics. And I always debate whether to put this one in, but if you do advanced thinking reading, especially in the area of education, and a lot of ministry scholarship is rooted in education scholarship, you will run into this idea of critical thinking, that it's looking for power dynamics, and it's called critical theory. So for some scholars, critical theory is critical thinking. Now I'm going to tell you something, and you got to remain critical with this. Critical theory is Marxism applied to philosophy, not to politics, but to philosophy. Now, Marx is screwed up in politics and philosophy, but he was actually pretty good at pointing out problems, terrible at coming up with solutions. I'm not advocating critical theory, but it does have a point. You know, that comparing viewpoints thing, here's a viewpoint to compare. So what does critical theory say? It says powerful people manipulate weak people, I left a word out there, to think and act against their own best interest. That is, powerful people manipulate how weak people think so that weak people will think in the interests of the powerful person and against their own interests as a weak person. And Deanna this time had a quote that she rightly critiqued, but as soon as I read the quote, I smiled. I said, there's critical theory. Here it is. This is quoted from Deanna's post. Victor Quinn's aim for critical thinking is to enable school leavers to read and interpret the world so they are neither cowed by authority figures nor swindled out of their civic birthright by tabloid and political cultures that prize persuasion over reason. He's saying critical thinking is helping people when they leave school, and I think he's using school leavers to take into account both graduates and dropouts, that when people leave school, that they won't be manipulated by more powerful people. And I don't know Victor Quinn, but I would bet that he looks at it as a school as a place where powerful people manipulate weak people. Don't know that for sure. I'm nearly out of time, so I have to move on. Looking for power dynamics is another form of critical thinking. Then, as Christians, we have to say, evaluating my thoughts by the Bible is a reliable process. Now, many people look at someone and many non-Christians hear a Christian say, I think biblically, and they think that's uncritical thinking because you're taking the authority of the Bible at face value instead of thinking for yourself. That's true if we're using biblical as an excuse for acting on my prejudices. Someone called common sense the sum of all my prejudices, and sometimes biblical is the sum of all my religious prejudices. But if I rigorously test my own thoughts by the Bible, then that is biblical critical thinking. What did Jesus say? Judge not. Don't be critical, that you be not judged. But I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time. Look at the part that I've emphasized. You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye. Critical thinking is subjecting my own thoughts to rigorous examination. It's not about rigorously examining everyone else. I have to before their thoughts become mine. But it's about my own thoughts. And then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. My time is up. Thanks for thinking. Feel free to get in touch with me as you need to.